Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As always, we thank you for joining us on our YouTube and Facebook pages, Page Turners Plus. Today, we'll be reflecting on Anthony Joseph's The Frequency of Magic. To tell you a bit about Anthony Joseph and the frequency of magic, we have Eric.
Thank you, Roger, and hello, everybody. Anthony Joseph is a poet, novelist, musician, and academic who was born in Trinidad and Tobago. He has won the 2023 T.S. Eliot and Bocas Lit Fest Poetry Prizes for his collection entitled Sonnets for Albert. He is also the author of several other collections of poetry. The Frequency of Magic, the novel which we will discuss today, is one of three long works of fiction created by the author. Written in the surrealist tradition, the frequency of magic is crafted primarily in verse and disrupts not only conventions of linear narrative form, but also the very notion of reality. Raphael, the novel's principal protagonist, has been writing a novel for 41 years. His characters are unruly. They habitually escape the confines of the novel to embark on adventures the author has not sanctioned. The novel is set primarily in Trinidad. Although rebellious as they are, some of the characters take off to wander about Europe and the United States of America. Among the concerns of the novel are ideas of community, family, love, nostalgia, and the tensions between social obligations and self fulfillment. The frequency of magic is as rambunctious as it is poetic. It may well be a literary representation of the wonder, resignation, and complaint inherent in Caribbean people's frequent pronouncement that this island is not a real place.
Thank you very much, Eric. For our viewers who are very keen, you may realize that we are one short today, but I'm sure we'll have an equally riveting and invigorating discussion nonetheless. So to start off the discussion, I suppose we could sort of pick up where Eric left off in terms of mentioning that this is Anthony Joseph's second novel. So my question is the frequency of magic a novel or a long, if not epic poem? Who wants to start?
I can start with that.
Yeah.
Definitely the novel. I will argue that it is a novel. The novel is poetic. The language is poetic. The imagery is poetic, and I think Joseph takes poetic liberties in crafting the text. Even though, as we just mentioned, the novel itself does turn convention on its head. Uh, I still believe that it is a novel. It is a novel about a novel, and within that novel, on the pages, are separate novel entities. I would say.
I think I can add to that if I may. In your synopsis, Eric, you did talk about the non-linear nature of it, which certainly gives that a poet a license to play, their trade, and which Anthony Joseph certainly did. Um, the what I got as well from the arc of the novel, and it's a word that he uses for quite often in the novel anyway, um, was a lot of the story was written off the page. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying to you. Um, a lot of the occurrences in the novel were almost periphery to what one would expect to be a central plot. Um, so, so it was inverted. It's probably the word I'm looking for, and that to me was also quite interesting. And
I
what
think
as a result, sorry, Kessler, what happened as a result? It was that there was no concentrated development of any one character. It was just a lot of. It was busy in that sense. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
I wonder if sometimes a reader might feel it feels more like a poem than a novel because there's not a lot of direct speech. A lot of events are reported on and embellished and narrated rather than happening before your eyes. You have a lot of backstory of people, which is the telling in some ways, and the novel within the novel. Um, So I think it can feel like a poem because of the lyricism of the novel. But I'd agree with Eric that it's certainly a novel. It's just a really unique surrealist, perhaps, take on a novel.
I would argue that it's even several novels within a novel because there were, if you were able to pick up the threads as they came, you could see that there were really different stories being told that kind of, in my mind, didn't really bear any relationship to each other except to the fact that he was speaking about people who came from one community. I think that was what was connecting them, but there were like several different stories happening throughout the book. And yeah, so for me it was several novels within a novel, and very surrealistic. At times it felt like stream of consciousness writing. Like you said, Kesua, there was very little dialogue. It was mostly reporting. It felt very stream of consciousness to me. Very surreal, very magical realism as well. So yeah.
But wasn't that the theme, essentially, that he established early, where Raphael sort of started this work, took 41 years to do it because he couldn't rein it in. The characters that he created just went awry, okay? And therefore, um, the one story became a multitude of stories, not of the author's making necessarily. The Raphael, the author I'm talking about, not Anthony Joseph, right? So I thought he established that from very early.
I would even say that it's very Caribbean. In fact, as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, this might be the most Caribbean book we've ever reviewed. Because a lot of the way the fact that the people just kind of, the characters went off and did their own thing, and the way that he wrote it reminded me of how Caribbean people tell stories, where you start off with one thing, but then you have to go and pull in. Oh, but remember, so and so said, and you have to go and pull another piece of the story. And I
So
really felt
it's a
like,
simultaneous nature of the
right,
events,
I
which is
really
what he was
felt like
capturing.
it. This I was listening to like my parents and their friends telling
Mhm.
all their stories, and you have to pull in all the characters and
Or when
explain
we are
who is
off
who.
screen and we're talking among
When we
ourselves.
are off screen and we are talking about the books. Exactly.
Yeah,
So
I
for
think
me, it was like I feel like it was the most Caribbean book we've reviewed.
I think I agree with everyone. This was a novel about a novel about a novel, and so you had all these different stories coming together, all these different characters, and I think Joseph wanted to show us what goes into writing a novel. So, for example, I follow Leonie Ross, who's One Sky Day we reviewed maybe 2 years ago, and I follow her on Instagram, and she details the process of writing her novel. So she's writing a novel right now, and from Frequency of Magic, I could see what goes into character development for a novel. The novel gives you that because it moves from Raphael to Luke to Melchior, and I think that in itself shows us what the process of writing is for a novel. So it's an unconventional novel, but a novel nonetheless. And in terms of Anthony Joseph's background, he has a strong poetic and musical background as well. So I don't think he could have evaded that coming out in his writing. And for those who had the benefit of listening to the audiobook, it was quite clear that he wanted it to be like that, and I don't think he was trying to escape his poetic background as well. So, I mean, I guess I could still ask the question: is this a novel about the process of writing? Did you pick that up? I mean, for those who study, in terms of academics, the way you write and go about writing, did you get that from this novel? Who wants to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think this is a book about the craft, and uh, and at times you have to be really sharp in reading. And of course, you're reading the book. We got deadline to you want to get through the book as fast as you can, and so I think this book definitely needs a second, maybe a third read, but definitely uh, the craft. I mean, Raphael's family situation butts into his writing. His own life butts into it. His job as a butcher butts into the process. He wants to spend time, but he can't spend as much time as he would like. Uh, and in the end, this is really not a spoiler, but in the end, in terms of the end of the process, Raphael really isn't writing to be published. Uh, Trying to get these stories out, and there's one part in the text in which the narrator says that the writer, everything about writing, and especially a novel, the writer's writing about himself or herself. So in a sense, every character are just different expressions or manifestations of the writer. So I mean, that's some keen insight, I think, and that's something I walk away with from reading this text.
And just to jump on that, because there was one part in the book that really stood out to me, and I think I highlighted it with respect to the fact that Raphael wasn't writing to be published. They would describe him how he became a butcher. And very clear, the author by this time, I mean Anthony Joseph, clearly stated that when he realized that he was good at butchering, he felt relief because he knew that he didn't need to depend on having his book published to make money from his book to live, that he could live from being a butcher while writing the book, which I think is something that's probably quite common for
Mhm.
many authors. We were briefly touched on that just before coming on air, that, many authors also work other jobs, and that allows them to be able to write, basically.
Mm.
And I remember, particularly when we spoke to Sherry Jones on that topic, it really stuck with me that she said, the fact of working in a 9 to 5 meant that her writing, her art, her true calling was liberated from the pressures of having to feed her family. Um, that it just reminded me of that, that this idea that actually we often dream of writing, or there's often this idea that your passion can feed you, and you'll never work a day in your life if your job is your passion. But actually, another way of looking at it is that especially if you're an artist, your art is free of commercial concerns when something else is paying your bills, right?
To get back on something Eric spoke about, about the craft, and the novel being about the craft of writing. Well, that certainly came out, but there was something that I couldn't help but noticing at the very start of the book, where he takes up space in his latrine to write the book, and to me that set the tone of the novel. And I'm not saying that the novel is full of that, but I'm just saying that even in his latrine, there are distractions there, the blue flies, the and I'm telling you, this novel gets very graphic, as you know, as we go along. But it really sets the tone of Raphael's attempt to confine all these characters in the page. But yes, the craft of writing, I felt was something that Anthony Joseph took pains to point out in his narrative through the novel, and I think that's what he wanted as well.
And then I remember from, well, our conversation with Leonie Ross. I'm thinking I'm correct here. She mentioned that her book, This One Sky Day, she was writing it for 15 years before it got published. And I think Joseph was trying to show us almost exactly that, in terms of, some people have an image of writing novels as, you get up one morning and say, I'm going to write a book. And you sit to your computer for 48 hours straight, high on caffeine, and you churn out 100,000 words in 2 days. So I think he wanted to show us that, it's
It's a
small
process
steps. It's a process. It's
with
small
many
steps each day
distractions, with
with
many
many,
distractions. So,
precisely.
so,
Uh,
so that's what I meant when I said the guy
mhm.
took refuge in his latrine to shut that out. But even then, he couldn't. You know.
Exactly. And Joseph was quite technical with it, because he has 100 chapters of 1,000 words each. That's, I
Mm.
mean, I assume the editing process was quite strange, and he would cut out like a strange the or strange
Yeah,
to get it
yeah.
down.
But as you
But
bring that up, Roger, and I'm sorry to if I'm
Go ahead.
belittling your questions, but as you bring that 1,000 words for each chapter, did y'all think that that was tied to the actual name of the book, the frequency of magic? Because frequency is a cyclical recurrence, right? If you to put the word in its true meaning, it's cycles that occur in over a period of time, about per second, as we would say in physics, right? But so the 1,000 words, I felt, was deliberate in tying it to the name of the novel, and of course, the magic took place within the 1,000 words, right? So I just thought I'd bring that up.
I actually thought the title also was the idea of tuning into magic, like a radio frequency. It wasn't just about the regularity, but it's also about how do you connect with your own magic or the magic around you. Was another way. I noticed it referred to it a few times in the book as poems as the frequency of magic. I think is what they said. And I also was contemplating the title as well. So yeah, interesting that we have different takes on it.
Could also be that frequency of magic is the art, because frequency, we got a musician who's featured. Frequency, we have an actor who's featured, and Raphael delves also into poetry. Frequency in terms of art, even the art of spiritual practices, especially among the spiritual Baptists that are that are featured in the text. So I think the frequency is wide range. But getting back to Tony's specific point, that I think you're reading at a pace, and yeah, you're reading at a rhythm. You can snap your fingers to. Each chapter is this length. I never picked up on it until I'm looking at my my Nook, and I'm seeing 7 minutes for this chapter. Then it goes down to 5, then it goes down to 2. So it's like, oh, it's really taking me like 5 minutes to read each chapter. So I know what to expect as I figuratively, virtually turn the page. So yeah, definitely, I had to be intentional, and part of the entirety, the whole structure of the text, which I think is genius and imaginative.
And well, I suppose he confirmed your suspicion, Eric, in the audiobook, which is available for free on the Bocus Lit website. Um, because he has some chapters as 9 minutes, some as 12, some as 10, even though they're all 1,000 words. And, and because he's backed by a band, you're able to pick up different songs, different tones, different pitches to set the mood. So you're able to understand that, okay, this chapter is a sad chapter, this is a happy chapter, this is a chapter where you're meant to be scared. So I think he does a really good job of establishing the mood for each chapter with the audiobook as well. So this would be a good time, since we're halfway through the show, to take the reading from Anthony Joseph so you can understand what we're talking about in terms of the frequency of magic and how poetic it is. So we ask you to stay tuned. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion.
Hi, my name is Anthony Joseph, and I'm the author of The Frequency of Magic, a novel that came out in 2019. I'm going to read chapter 70 of The Frequency of Magic. In The Frequency of Magic, Raphael tells the story of Prentice, Jack Blake, and Jim. This happened many years ago when Bullfrog used to smoke hard weed and Bois for Gael used to cut from black pouy or Gaspery wood. When Prentice wanted to kill Jim and Jack Blake wanted to kill Jim too, but Jim was not afraid of either of them. Jim was from Upper Cadogan village, where taxi wouldn't go, where sin and shame living side by side like corrugation vine, where hand feeding hand and gun mouth narrow, where shinbone meeting ankle, where even rain does fear to fall sometimes, and all matter of animal walking upright, looking for people to bite. Jim was leaning on a pillar post overlooking the village, spitting banana seeds. Then he bumped down to the avenue. He was a solid soul stick twirler, dressed in black with cockroach killer boots. He climbed the rickety stairs at the back of the Black Silk Bar in Chenet Tree Junction, a place they say never sleep, and indeed, far gone midnight, the barber still cutting hair, the chiropodist open, naked bulb bright in calypso snacket, and they shelling out fried chicken and pigeon peas rice. Shortcut does end up in cut up down there. People does get their neck lock or chop up. It's not one suffer these people suffer, is much. But they're still ready to ramp. They licking hand like puss, eating roast bacon bull joel. When night come, they roasting fowl and assuming gooty look back position, skinning up on the sweet man bed, jumping window when they hear the husband jitney pulling. They will pull out wood still dripping oil because oil don't spoil. These days, they say how Massa they done, how the village evolve, how the ghetto get gentrified, how Tanty Merle and Uncle Mike dead long time and gone to grave. Now the Lego Rock Festival and open whiskey bar near where Melcore selling tuna and shrimp. But that couldn't stop Jack Blake and Prentice from jacking Jim up on the black silk stairs. Prentice and Jack have malice against Jim, and it long in the tuber root. They're clapping blades for his demise, since Cunny never have hair nor Cunny hole, and they bind in cahoots versus poor Jim. So when Jim flashed the spot, all three start to wrestle on the stairs, and the stairs start to rock in that muscle of emotion when grown men fighting like android. It's hard to watch because the eye too slow, the meditation too narrow, and the vision going against eye expectation. You seeing what you don't often see, man at man throat, hard and primitive grip of man hand, big men getting collar up. Jim muscle grip Jack Blake wrist, prevented from piercing. That hand was twisting to puncture Jim liver with a blade. Jack mouth start gargling. He bawl, "Let I go or die, Lego I." With his free hand, he reaching for Jim throat. Prentice confused. Men from upper rooms at the Black Silk get disrupt from their wappy game. Come outside and watch how these three men fighting on the stairs like teeth from teeth from teeth. But they're mainly wrestling. Blows hard to fire in that limiting clinch of strength and rage. Wrist like snake rubber twisting an aluminum bucket. Was worries in the junction, and Swamp Dog starts singing from the barbershop below. Spirit dust, your head, color red. No one could part them. At times like this, a simple blow could kill or maim. Sometimes the hit may come unexpected, like an old black duke with a cane who, if you get him vexed, could still place a blow precise enough to bust your head. Don't mind you as villain, and you young and fierce, he will hit you. That's why men must be careful when they're fighting, because a stray blow can kill, and then you're charged for murder, you're facing jail. You'd just come out the road to buy 6 hops bread and a tin of sardine, and you get in tryst with some reprobate. The next thing, you get locked up and somebody else minding your children, some other man dealing with your wife. Prentice rushing stupid. Jim shook him with a shank to the floating rib, but Prentice still fighting. Jim shook him again in the same place and twisted until blood ran out, and Prentice bowed to mercy and fail. Prentice get licks like a stepchild who, after running wild in the neighborhood, over ravines and up Plumtree, get held by the neck and receive a sweet cut ass, belt all around his back. Jack Blake trying now to cut Jim on the wrist, but Jim get the handle and Jack Blake hold the blade. Jimmy Ball, "Lego the damn blade." When he pull, he cut Jack to the bone. Jack moan. Jim was a demon. He bad like cut-tailed snake. Jack wrapped the bloody hand in his shirt and he run to seek solace upstairs in the silk. And that was the first time that Jack Blake known to bury dead man in a carrow, give over and cry out. Poor fella, he was in pain. Siren coming up the road, but Jim jumped 40 feet from the balcony and flee like a lizard. He run up the quarry behind the frolic house, as villain, beast, and killer of men. He hard to dead, long to kill, like wild rabbit neck cut, but it keep kicking. Raphael write it down, and he done with that. He closed the book for the night. He turned off the radio. He defy Aristotle, Hemingway, and Forster. He never say why these men were at war, what who do or who do what. He never gave clue to a chord for merit or role, for causality or motive, and yet crick crack, the action rolled. He make the reader read, and somehow the story get told.
All right, welcome back. Here at Page Turners Plus, I think we've developed quite a tradition that immediately after we have the reading, we delve into the more controversial topics. So the question that I want to throw out to the panel is, how do you feel about the way sexuality was portrayed in the novel? And I feel like this will probably take up all of the time, but anyone wants to start with how sexuality was portrayed in the novel?
Brutal. That's one of the words I'll use. There was nothing. There was nothing warm, tender about anything to do with you got sexuality. Well, I'm talking about sex scenes as well. The interaction between the females and the males in the book. Nothing tender at all about. The males were portrayed as animals, virtually trying to hunt down females, pin them down, and almost in a non-consensual way. And it wasn't rape, but it was not tender, right? And the language he used to describe it. I know we are on national TV, but there's some words that implied, harsh physical action, which it's typical, however, Roger, of the Caribbean society in the time I believe this novel's been written. So I think Anthony Joseph was being honest, but certainly he did not varnish any surface. He neither smoothed or varnished any surface. So I would leave my piece there.
Yeah, I
Eric?
mean, if you, but a few minutes into reading the text, you're gonna run into a lot of sex and sexual acts and sexual activity. Um, yeah, I felt those were genuine, and I think they were contextual as well. Um, I did think the relationship between Ella and the musician had a semblance of tenderness, though, Tony. Um, I think he loved her in her own way. She wanted him to love her, um, but time was of the essence with that relationship. But I think that was the most romantic, well, the most probably the only, yeah, probably the only really romantic element of the text in terms of men and women in their sexual relations. Um, but some were hilarious. Brenda, uh, uh, well, Deacon Simmons being backdoored by by somebody with his wife Brenda, and I think we get a really touching scene near the end. I love the way that Anthony Joseph closed out that relationship. That was a tender moment for me. So, with in all the muck and the messiness of sexual relations in the text, there are some nuggets of tenderness that reflect the capacity of human beings to love one another as men and women love love one another.
Roger, if I could just also quickly make a point before Francie and guess what comes in. The language that he used to describe a lot of the sex scenes, and as Eric said, there were a lot of them, you know, is reflected in the very lyrics of the calypsonians that he mentioned in the book, you know. So as Eric said, it's contextual. That is all part of the landscape of what was that time, you know, how you spoke about sex, how you objectified women, you know, because I certainly think women were objectified in this novel. Um, so yes, I felt that Joseph accurately and artistically captured what the cultural vibes were, and maybe to a large measure still is, you know, in Caribbean society when it comes to sexual relations.
Kasua, I feel like, or Francine, I feel like you both would have a lot to say.
Um, I don't know. I feel it bothered me that this was the only way that he portrayed relationships between men and women. Like, yes, I understand that historically, a lot of what he described is accurate, and that is how, yeah, things were, how men thought about women, how women were objectified. But I find it hard to believe that this was the only way that sexual relationships were being, what's the word, carried out at that time in the Caribbean. Because if so, how did we move beyond that? There had to be there had to be other context at the same time. I don't know if Kessel will agree with me.
Yeah, I mean, I was profoundly uncomfortable, I think it's fair to say, with the fact that almost every woman he described physically, and how the men who were around her were attracted to her. Even in exceptions to that, I found, I'm thinking of the mother and daughter. That story was told quite briefly, um, and without any of the care for detail I found when he was describing other sections. Now, as Tony's pointed out, like it might be that he's reflecting a norm of a different era, and so there's something to be said for allowing the space to reflect on the norms of that era by depicting it accurately. Um, but I think as a woman, it it felt sometimes quite gratuitous, needless. Also, I think it's fair to say, and like I said, ultimately, just quite uncomfortable to see women just kind of constantly through the eyes of men who objectified them, because ultimately he doesn't. If I remember correctly, the way the novel went, he doesn't ever like do something different, right? He doesn't show there was another way to engage men and women, or for women to have their own autonomy where they were active, interesting characters in their own rights. And in that case, are you just reproducing the norms that you claim to be portraying for historical accuracy, which as a historian, I appreciate. Um,
Yeah, you use the word about needless, and I would perhaps say the same thing, but I would say it was excessive. I think I got a sense of excess, you know, because there are points where I say, okay, I get it, you know, but it kept going on to make the point. So that over deliberateness was making me uncomfortable too, as well. You know, about the
And
author himself. Sorry to say, but
right,
you know,
and I also, for me, I mean, obviously the way the women were described, the object that I found that quite uncomfortable as well. But I also didn't like the way that he portrayed all the men. Like they're just all focused on one thing, and even that made me uncomfortable because I refuse to believe that that is true of all men at that time, regardless of where of their social condition.
I
that's
think
why I
there's
said that
something.
they pursued it in an animalistic way. Almost, he made the men look like animals, like a goat, a billy goat on a farm. You know, I mean, like.
I do think there's something. I do think there's something in the jazzman persona that he's picking up on, right? This idea of a Rolling Stone who picks up a woman in a different city, and there's a slight romanticizement of it, if we're really honest, in this novel. Um, and I think you read it like that kind of really masculine musician life. I think is kind of captured here, and and there's value in that. Although I wouldn't say it's a story that we've never heard before. Um, and I think he just kind of does it in the Caribbean context, right? And is that exciting and new? Perhaps, but I think that's the root of it. I don't think it comes from necessarily a place of malice. Perhaps a certain nostalgia or a desire to kind of remember how it used to be simple for men. But as you say, Tony, when he describes them as so, I don't know if I'd go with animalistic, but certainly base and simple.
Base, simple, primordial almost.
Yeah. There's a question of like, why that choice? The question I would ask the author is, why did you make that choice? I'd be curious to know why you thought that was a useful, important intervention at this early stage of the 21st century.
But to his defense, the author, that is not Raphael, the real author, Anthony Joseph, he does have the same intensity with describing other cultural aspects of the novel, right? So I don't think it was just the sex where he exuded that sort of style and intense form of writing. What I found, and I hope I'm not going off of this question a bit, Roger, but what I found as well was how he focused on disease, all these sores, all these body fluids oozing out of people, I mean, that I also found a bit excessive, but I understood what he was doing, and in the Caribbean, diabetes is a thing, right? And a lot of those women in that novel, women in particular, seem to have had the diabetic issue. I can't remember a woman in there without a sore foot. Was there any? Maybe Ella didn't have one. Ella was her name. Yeah, the actor. But yeah, he was equally as intense in his descriptions of disease. So I just thought I'd throw that to his defense. It wasn't that he has sexual fetishes or he's a pervert or any such thing,
Yeah, so if we join those two themes together, and I definitely noticed that if we join those two themes together, I think what Anthony Joseph is getting at is some deep-seated structural issues in the society that I don't think he pathologizes the people one bit, but he does refer back to, and these are subtle references. He refers back to slavery. He refers back to, and I mean, he's writing the most of the novel is set in the late colonial period, so we can't forget that. We can't forget the structure of slavery and what the deep legacy of that upon our health, upon the way that men treat women, uh, the way that we go about our business and see ourselves, and also how uh, the system of slavery impacted and still impacts our diets. Um, it's wherever and throughout the America. Doesn't have to be in the Caribbean. It's also in North America as well. Uh, the experience it's a collective experience, and I think he did a fantastic job there and really want to raise awareness of where we've been and even where we are because it's still prevalent, obviously.
And I think the lack of sort of, if I could call it narrative, in terms of you just get one person's perspective on all these things happening in the novel. So for example, the section where Ella was heading to school and the men were catcalling her, and um, even though she sat with her legs crossed and her skirt over her knees, she was still being harassed, etc. We never really hear Ella's perspective on how this impacted her. We just see these men as brutes, and and they were brutes. But Joseph never really gives you the perspectives of the women. You're being told a story from a man's perspective, and we may see these things as negative, and they are, but maybe 1970s, 1980s men, they think this is absolutely normal. This is life. And as Kesua mentioned, this is sort of the jazzman experience. I'm trying to get it, in that I'm trying to get every woman I could possibly get, make children here, there, and everywhere. And maybe Joseph isn't necessarily glorifying that experience, but he's drawing to our attention to say, look, this is something that happened in the post-colonial period, the immediate post-colonial period, and we need to work on it. We need to correct it.
Yeah, I
That's
agree with you.
yeah.
I mean, it's no coincidence that included in the pages were the Caribbean, lyricists of the time, Kitchener and Sparrow and Zanduli and all these people. Because, like I said earlier, if you really examine their lyrics, they were a bit more well, they use far more metaphors and so on to soften what they were talking about. They weren't as raw, but inside what they were speaking about was that very way that men viewed women, post-colonial, post-slavery fallout of the societal structure at at the time. So I feel that's where the novel is placed, to be honest, in that
Mhm.
in that era.
Yeah, and he also mentioned only one mention. He mentioned Joe Tex, the blues R&B, and he crossed over into disco. I ain't gonna bump no more with that big fat woman. But Joe Tex was uh famous, or maybe we can say infamous. It just depends on your perspective of highly sexualized lyricism in his songs. So yeah, I think Anthony Joseph has tapped the era. I think we should land on that he tapped the era, and definitely from a masculine perspective, and to use the phrase that we use today, a very toxic masculinity. Um, that I think he's highlighting, not not to praise it, but to criticize it, because we're moving, and put it that we're moving away from that, and we're highly critical of that now.
And
Yeah,
I think he wanted to show us the folly of the men's ways as well, because I mean, not trying to reveal too much, but we know the story of the man who has a high position in the church, the deacon
Deacon.
who comes home and is shocked at his wife's infidelity
Mm.
when he has a mistress. I mean, and he's completely flabbergasted at this, and then he just moves on with his mistress. I mean, I think Anthony Joseph was showing us that these are the things that men would be upset about if it doesn't happen to them. And I think he's trying to show us both sides of the coin in terms of how ridiculous some of the sexualizations of the women by these men were.
But Roger, as you mentioned era, as you were unmuting,
Yeah.
as you mentioned era, and Eric um, said that's where we should, place this thing. A lot of the similes, and the book is pregnant with them, are very Caribbean, eh? And I think that's why Francine earlier said that it is one of the most Caribbean novels that we've read. And I enjoyed the book from that perspective. A lot of the similes, a lot of what he says, and there's so many of them that I can't even remember one now. I've got a mental block, sensory overload, but there were so many funny Caribbean similes and slangs. Crap or smoke your pipe. You know, I just enjoyed how he was able to populate the pages um, with, with that. It was
In
brilliant.
that, was he not reminiscent? There. In that, I think he was quite reminiscent of Jacob Ross. I remember that was something about his style, where it was like there was no simile that didn't point to something in the Caribbean somewhere that wasn't a cultural reference. Like it was really powerful for that. And I wonder if, and I'm describing it as like a whole grammar that he kind of
You know,
created.
you remember when the musician returned and he came with his big dicks, his big talk, his high talk, whatever. And I think it was Tanty somebody um, was looking at him. They turned him around, they examined him, and then they they start to say, we could remind you of where you came from, right? We could put you under a river to cut iron bamboo with razor blade, right? Or dig latrine with a plastic fork. You know, you ain't getting that anywhere else but the Caribbean. If you don't understand the Caribbean experience, you're lost in that whole that that whole two paragraphs. And
No,
I just found it so
no,
skillful and so good.
that section reminded me of a running conversation I had with a friend of mine. We both have PhDs, and when we go home, when we go back to Louisiana, and we in our mother's house, we are not Doctor So and So and Doctor whatever. We empty the trash. We screw in light bulbs. We tack up whatever. Uh, no special privileges. We are sons. We're family, and um, yeah, I got that from that section as well. It's like a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown.
Yeah, this was a rich Caribbean text, and I even referred to this like very often, like really often. I mean, I probably should be ashamed of myself having spent a year in Trinidad, and I didn't know what bubbly meant. But I know now. I know now. But I think it was really rich. It was a really rich Caribbean text, and Joseph. I mean, he lives now in the diaspora, but he shows his connection to Trinidad, his rich connection to Trinidad, and it comes out in his other work as well. I've read Ketch and I've read Sonnets for Albert, and he's done a really good job of showing his Trinidad side while living in the diaspora. So I mean, we're almost out of time. So I suppose I could just ask, how do you feel about the way the novel addressed the Caribbean immigrant experience? And I mean, there are a few examples of it in the novel. So we could probably just talk about that as we wind down. Francine, I'm not sure if you wanted to.
I think that part of the book really jumped out at me as someone who lives in the diaspora, but specifically because the musician spent quite a lot of time in Europe and in France, where I live. So that is why the whole immigrant experience thing really resonated with me in this novel. And I realized that, in fact, he addressed it in a number of different ways. What I found interesting was the ways that he addressed how people chose to immigrate. For example, like, there was Drayton, I think, who met a British woman in Carnival at Panorama, and he moved to England to be with her. And Ella, I think, got I guess a scholarship to go study. And the musician, I'm unclear as to exactly. In fact, I'm wondering if the musician was not Drayton, because did the musician ever have a name? I don't think he was ever named, right? Yeah. So yeah, it jumped out to me that he really did examine the immigrant experience in a number of different ways and in different countries, and how it impacted the characters.
Yeah, I was also really pleased by the fact that he addressed like being an English speaker and still finding your way to France. I think often in when we think about the immigrant experience, we're always thinking about going to the US, going to Canada, going to the UK. That's such a big part of our history that we're not aware of, or we don't perhaps think about enough the implications of. Um, I really liked him bringing that to the fore. I thought it was really valuable and useful.
It made me think also, actually, when he was talking about the musician going around Europe, I thought a lot about Sheikh Keen. Did any of you guys think about Sheikh Keen?
Yeah, I got a shaking
I got a
sense
Sheikh Keen
at some
sense. And at one
stage.
point, he even
Yeah.
mentioned the Vincentian poet in Brooklyn. I was like,
I thought I was shaking when he
yeah,
mentioned it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But Roger, the and this is not the answer to the migrant question that you asked, but the ultimate characters in the book that traverse the globe, um, the Grand Bandit and Luke. I thought that they were the anchors of this novel. They were either North Pole, South Pole, trying to converge. And I don't know if any of you looked at them as human characters or just a force. I got that sense that the Grand Bandit was more of a force, and Luke being pursued was a counterbalance to it. I don't know. I mean,
At one
I
point, I thought the Grand Bandit was Michael Joseph, the author. Sorry, Anthony Joseph, the author. Like
I thought it was Raphael at one point as well. So yeah, it's interesting to I th-
It was
at
Raphael.
another point, it seemed like it was Luke was the one who kind of imagined the great bandit, because at one point he was sitting somewhere and he saw the great bandit, or he felt the force. So I think you're right, Tony, that it's like a force, or a
yeah, it
spirit,
kind of felt that way.
or
But the
a
reason why I tied that to the migrant question was the I, I know it's probably not what Roger intended, but it is the regions that Luke traveled and the Grand Bandit as a consequence in pursuit, you know. And I was wondering if that wasn't Anthony Joseph trying to talk about us as a nomadic or migrant sort of people, albeit one was in pursuit of the other to get into the pages of Raphael's head and what the plot was for him, the Grand Bandit. But I was just wondering if that wasn't a metaphor for that too, our movement across the globe.
I think it probably was, because we never really fully understand who or what the Great Bandit is, and I think Joseph wants us to interpret it in many ways, including probably possibly the way that you mentioned it. Unfortunately, though, our conversation is coming to an end because we're out of time. It has been a really wonderful conversation on Anthony Joseph's The Frequency of Magic. The next time you see us, we'll be interviewing, as is becoming customary now, Anthony Joseph. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.